Today we will speak about Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe. Let me begin with a quote from a study written by the Harvard history professor Jill Lepore. Speaking about Edgar Allan Poe, he says, "His world was Andrew Jackson's America." Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States. His world was Andrew Jackson's America, where banking collapse, financial panic, grinding depression devastated the public industry, where Poe sought to perch. He suffered particularly in the panic of 1819 and 1837 and died at the end of the hungry 40s. Poverty was his raven tapping at the door. And the mention of the raven, I hope it sounds elusive to all of you, because you have already read the works of Edgar Allan Poe, of which the most famous poem by far is precisely The Raven. We'll speak about The Raven a little more in depth as we go through the biography of Edgar Allan Poe. He was born on the 19th of January 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts. He was born to a couple of actors. His mother was Eliza or Elizabeth Poe, and his father was David. When Edgar Allan Poe was 9 months old, his father David deserted them. He abandoned them. So Eliza was left alone with the 9-month-old Poe and 2 other children. She was trying to make ends meet and to fend for herself and for her 3 children, and she was not able to. She succumbed to tuberculosis. She contracted the fatal illness and died when Edgar Allan Poe was only 2 years old. By the way, his name back then was Edgar Poe. Allan would come later into the scene. Young 2-year-old Edgar watched helpless as his mother died, coughing blood and being delirious. She was only 24 years old and she died to tuberculosis. Edgar says that he holds very dear memories of his mother, although it's quite uncertain if he actually remembered her, he was only 2, or if he idealized her. In any case, he kept with himself a little portrait of his mother, which he treasured for all of his life. And just a few days after his mother's death, his older brother William was taken to his grandparents, and the other 2 children, his sister and Edgar himself, were given in adoption. Edgar was allocated with a rich Scottish tobacco merchant. He was a self-made businessman, and his name was John Allan. It is there where Edgar Allan Poe gets his last name. He was allocated to the family of this John Allan and his wife Fanny Allan. John was harsh and unloving. To some extent, Edgar felt ashamed of his last name. That's why he rarely signed Edgar Allan Poe. He signed Edgar A. Poe, the A standing for Allan. Instead, Fanny was very loving. We can almost picture the scene of John and Fanny discussing and considering the possibility of adopting a child. Fanny was an adopted child herself, so they didn't have any children, and it's mostly Fanny who wanted to adopt a child, whereas John was not enthusiastic about the idea. Maybe he just conceded to kind of please his wife, but he was never a father figure for Edgar Allan Poe, let alone a loving father. In 1815, John transferred to London with his family. They would stay there for 5 years until the crisis of 1819 broke his tobacco business and made him return to the US in 1820. So we have a young Edgar Allan Poe living in London from 1815 through 1820. What happened in those times in London? The publishing of Northanger Abbey, and especially the publishing of Frankenstein. So young Edgar Allan Poe was in London when Frankenstein was published. When they came back to America, Edgar found a loving, nurturing mother figure in the mother of one of his schoolmates. Her name was Jane Stranard. And some say he fell in love with her, he idealized her, he worshipped her, but she went insane and died of a tumor cancer, of brain cancer. Edgar was only 14, and this loss devastated him. He spent long time mourning by her grave, and soon after this disease, Fanny, his adoptive mother, his foster mother, was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Although John Allan's business was broken, he received a rich inheritance from an uncle. Maybe in today's money it would be something like $2 million. So that was enough for him to be financially stable and to launch his business anew. However, Edgar didn't benefit from this at all. John Allan started having various affairs, even in his own house, with his infected wife being there. Young Edgar Allan Poe, maybe he was 15, of course he opposed to this because of the love and respect he had for his adoptive mother, who was sick and dying from tuberculosis. So in an attempt to get rid of him, John Allan sent him to the Virginia University with only the necessary money to get there. So the young freshman was struggling to survive, to make ends meet, and he decided to make money in a risky way. Gambling money, apostando. That was not a good idea, as you can imagine. And he piled up a debt of over $2,000 in the money back then. I checked in the internet, so in the 1820s, how much was worth $1 in today's money? It was worth like $35 in today's money. So this debt was something like $70,000 in today's money. Yeah, it was a big debt. And back then, there were debt prisons. So you could be sent to prison because of debts. So trying to escape from his creditors, he joined the army with a false name. He joined the army, and this brings up another phase of Edgar Allan Poe, because we usually are used to seeing his picture where he looks pale, thin, suffering from all the damage that alcohol had brought to his health, and he's sickly. Well, he was actually athletic. It's reported that he swam 6 miles upriver. So that's quite an accomplishment. It's like 3 times of the swimming. It's 3 times the swimming segment of an Ironman proof. So he was very athletic, and he rose very rapidly in the military ranks. From just entering the army in less than 2 years, he was promoted to sergeant. And in 1829, Fanny, his foster mother, died. I'm saying his foster mother and not his adoptive mother because although they received Edgar into their home, they never legally adopted him. Nevertheless, Fanny was a mother figure for him. So if you look at Edgar Allan Poe's life, by 1829, meaning when he was 20 years old, he had already experienced 3 major losses in his life. And all those losses were losses of a motherly figure. He would move to Baltimore. Then he would, first he moved to New York, but being unable to maintain himself, he moved to Baltimore. He also joined the West Point Academy. As you know, it's a military academy. And I'm not sure how things went, but the point is he needed the permission from his father John Allan, from his foster father John Allan, to leave the academy. And since John didn't have any interest in having him leave the academy, he made sure that they expelled him for his offenses, his quarreling with authority, and all the riots he created that ended up getting him expelled. That was the only way he could leave the West Point Academy back then. So he tried to make a living in New York. He couldn't. He moved to Baltimore. And this could be maybe the only happy episode or the happy parenthesis in his life. Because in Baltimore, he encountered his aunt, Maria Clem. Maria Clem, who became also like a mother figure to him. Sometimes in his poem, particularly one of his poems that is, whose title is "To My Mother," that is dedicated to Aunt Maria Clem. And especially, Aunt Maria Clem had a daughter. Her name was Virginia. She was only like 12 years old, and the next year they would get married. Yes, he married his cousin. He married his cousin. He was 26, she was 13. That was frowned upon, so that was not well seen back then or today. So she lied in her certificate, and it is said that she said she was 21. I don't know how they believed her, but she said she was 20. She said she was 21. So in the certificate, it's written that she was 21. Nevertheless, they kept their marriage secret because they got married in secret, at least for 1 year, and then after 1 year, they had a party to celebrate their marriage. He was obsessed with her, and he was a loving husband by all accounts. From all the testimonies that we gather, that was a happy parenthesis in his life. And in spite of all the turmoil and all the distress that he encountered in his public life and in his financial struggles and in his literary battles, for him, coming back home was always a safe haven. It was a refuge. In 1835, he was hired by the Southern Literary Messenger, and he was paid $6 a month. Again, back then, the dollar was worth a lot more than it's worth today, but still, $6 is not such a great fortune. But for him, it was way more than enough. And finally, he got some kind of financial stability to at least settle himself in a middle-class living style. However, he drank too much and he gambled, so those habits wreaked havoc in his finances. In 1837, he was hired by the New Yorker, and while he was continually employed, there are two things that became setbacks for him. First, he was too quarrelsome. He was fighting all the time with his bosses, and that got him fired. So he was hopping from one job to another without having any stability. In addition, he was a good writer, he was a renowned editor, but he was not famous. So he lived at the mercy of his publishers, and he had to do whatever they told him to do. It's not like he could sell his literary fame for a high price. He couldn't. It was also in 1837 when he published the only novel he wrote in his lifetime. Well, actually, when he wrote the only novel that he published. Do you have any idea of why he didn't write any novels other than this? The title is The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. That's the only novel that he published. But why didn't he write any novels during his lifetime?
He wasn't making money?
That's the reason why. He couldn't afford... To write a novel takes time, right? Let's be optimistic and say that he can write it in 6 months. Okay? He couldn't afford to spend 6 months without some kind of income. He needed to make money, so that's why he contented himself with writing short stories that he could sell on almost a weekly basis to make ends meet. He was living to the day. 1842. So he had already been married for a few years, but Virginia, his cousin/wife, was diagnosed with tuberculosis. A happy event for them was that in 1842, in March, Charles Dickens was on a tour in America, and they could meet him. Even if Edgar Allan Poe had been critical of him in some of his literary reviews, they could meet the great English novelist. By the way, Edgar Allan Poe was very critical of practically everything he encountered, and he was harshly and merciless. He was a great editor and a great literary critic, and when I say a great literary critic, I also mean that he was viciously harsh, and he could destroy with his pen any writing that he came across with. Of course, that gained him a lot of enemies. And that's why I was saying that in the turmoil of his struggles with financial life, with alcoholism, with gambling, and with all his enemies, and he being entangled in so many literary battles, his family life was a refuge for him. Now, with Virginia infected with tuberculosis, things took a wrong turn, and he became more and more obsessed, depressed. Things were very difficult for him. It is the year after this, 1843, when he published The Black Cat. Think of the alcohol problems that the protagonist of this story was dealing with. And maybe they reflect, to a significant extent, Edgar Allan Poe's own problems. 1845, the year The Raven was published. His most famous poem that brought to him a lot of fame. He became a celebrity. If before this he was not famous, he was renowned after he published The Raven. However, it came with very, very little financial gain. I think I'm not exaggerating if I say that he made like $15 with The Raven. Yes, so $15 was definitely not much money for him or for anyone. So he made very little money, but it was very widely accepted. It was read extensively. People had nightmares with the raven. Little kids started playing and mocking Edgar Allan Poe, calling him the raven, and he played along. And he turned around and would say nevermore, and the kids would follow him and bother him, but he played along with the kids because he became famous. And let's think a little about the raven tapping at his chamber door. From the Harvard scholar that we quoted at the beginning of this session, we see that poverty was that raven tapping at his chamber door. And of course, he was suffering from a lot of financial shortage. But he was also suffering a lot of emotional distress, especially with his wife being infected with tuberculosis. What is the problem, or what is the suffering of the protagonist in The Raven? He's mourning his deceased wife. So writing The Raven was like some anticipation. It was an anticipated mourning for his young wife that would soon be gone. Lenore could very well be Virginia herself. Two years after that, Virginia died. So The Raven was written like 2 years after the death, although it was clear that her health was going worse and worse. Yes, her health was just worsening. He published The Raven in 1845, and Virginia died 2 years after that, in January of 1847. January of 1847. Some friends had lended him money to take care of his wife because he couldn't afford the medicine, the heating, and the food to take care of her during this illness. And unfortunately, Allan wasted it all in gambling and in alcohol. 2 years after his wife's passing, he wrote Annabel Lee. It must have been sometime around, in early 1849. And you have that poem of Annabel Lee. One of the things that catches my attention from this poem is that Edgar Allan Poe was also a romantic. And he could, although he has been known to posterity as the psychologist of horror, his horror tales, poems, and stories are but a tiny parcel of his writing. Most of his writings were about literary criticism. And he could also write beautiful poems. So the question is, why did he obsess with writing dark tales? Some say, well, because of his own life experience. Not quite. Although there might be some autobiographical traits in his own dark stories, above all, it's because he needed to make a living. He wanted to keep away starvation. And he knew what would sell. Remember, he had been in London for the publishing of Frankenstein, and he knew what would sell. Again, he was a literary critic and he was an editor. So he was very much aware of what people would buy, of what people would receive. So he knew his audience, and he knew how to give them what they wanted, what they were asking for. That's the main reason why Edgar Allan Poe wrote, and why he wrote dark stories. That's the main reason, because that's what would be received. Coming back to The Raven, he became a celebrity, he was famous, and he was called several times to read, or actually not to read, but to declaim his poem, The Raven. And he filled theaters with people flocking to see him declaim his poem, The Raven. And testimonies give the account of how he declaimed it, and his eyes became became luminous when he was enacting the raven and so on. So it must have been quite a show. And you'd think, well, maybe this brought a little more money to him. Yes, it must have brought some money to him at the beginning, but since he was getting drunk so often, he showed up to these sessions drunk and he couldn't recite it well, so he sabotaged himself. He very often sabotaged himself, just like he had sabotaged himself from the military academy and from his several employments. He sabotaged himself in his lecturing on the Raven. He sabotaged himself. He even got an interview with the President of the United States, trying to get a position in the government, and he showed up badly dressed and drunk. So again, he sabotaged himself. Fortunately for him, a friend prevented him from going all the way, so he didn't meet the president in those conditions, and he just postponed his interview with the president. Then he showed up for the interview a little more sober. He got the position, but he sabotaged it again. So there's a constant of self-sabotage in his life. I mentioned his wife Virginia died in 1847, and Edgar was desperate for affection and for finding his female counterpart, for finding love. And he was so desperate that he started proposing marriage to anyone, and sometimes he proposed marriage to several women at the same time. So from one of his biographies, I read that he actually got engaged, and this looked like a positive prospect for him. But when I compared this with other biographies, I realized that this was just one among many engagements or many attempts, and none of them proved successful. An important one was when he proposed to a girl who was already engaged to Rufus Griswold. And Rufus Griswold would be one of his literary enemies. So he proposed to her, she turned him down, and she married Rufus Griswold. But we will come back to Rufus Griswold. After several attempts, in his desperation, he actually got a girl to say yes to him, and they became engaged. He went to share the news with his aunt, Maria Clem, who lived in Baltimore. But for some reason, he was found wandering loosely in the streets with another man's jacket, delirious, maybe drunk, and he was rushed to the hospital where he died after 3 or 4 days. And the circumstances of his death are still mysterious. We don't know what happened. We don't know if these were the consequences of his heavy drinking. Some conjecture that maybe he was a victim of a kidnap, or maybe some of his enemies, literary enemies, beat him, leaving him in that dire condition that brought about his death. Some others say that the family of his fiancée had him beaten to death because they didn't want him to marry her. So, but there are all conjectures. Was it physical ailment? Was it some health problem? Was it something that someone else had caused on him? Was he poisoned? It was also election day, so there were turmoils and riots. It was not a peaceful election, so there was a lot of tumult in the streets. Maybe he just wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. We absolutely don't know what happened to him. So he died in these mysterious circumstances. In a fit of recklessness or ignorance or desperation, his aunt, Mary Clem, gave all of his writings to Rufus Griswold. And he became his editor. and his biographer. That is why it's so difficult to get an objective account of Edgar Allan Poe's life, because most of his biography was written by his enemies, who wanted to cast dirt on him and belittle him and bemire him with contempt. I am pretty sure he must have had a drinking problem, but to what extent? Is that an exaggeration that his biographers have created to diminish his figure and to present him as a vile person? So it's just a question I ask myself. If you read, for example, the Wikipedia entry on Edgar Allan Poe, you get that gloomy, dark image of Edgar Allan Poe. But if you complement that with other biographies, you come to the realization that it's very difficult to have a clear idea of who he actually was, and if those gambling and drinking problems were as grotesque and as outlandish as some biographers make them. So it's very difficult for us to have an accurate assessment and an objective idea of who Edgar Allan Poe was. About his works, even if he was a great literary critic, and he even wrote some essays on the philosophy of aesthetics and what's the philosophy behind the narrative, just remember, keep in mind that he was not writing to satisfy his need for aesthetics or his need to create something philosophically beautiful. Why was he writing? Because he didn't want to starve. That was his motivation. That was his only and his main motivation. He wrote dark stories, especially during the times of depression, and I'm speaking about depression in this double sense. When he was depressed, but also when the nation was going through a major depression, especially with financial crisis. Edgar Allan Poe was always subject to the market forces. He had seen how Frankenstein was a bestseller in London, and he tried to emulate the success of Gothic literature. So the question about how much can we read Edgar Allan Poe's personality by reading into his works, that's a question that, at least in my opinion, remains open. You can trace, of course you can find traces of some of his idealized female figures. You can find the traces of his own problems with alcohol and gambling in his characters, but it's very difficult to know where to draw the line. This is his fiction and this is his real life. These are projections, or this is the psychoanalytic understanding of his personality behind his works. It's very difficult to draw the line. Remember as well, as I said, that the horror literature of Edgar Allan Poe is a tiny parcel of what he wrote. Most of his writings are not Gothic literature, are not horror stories. Most of his writings are literary criticism. So that was what he was renowned for in his time, even if what he sold best were his horror stories. And let me finish with this quote. It's also from the first source I mentioned. In an article that he entitled How to Write a Blackwood Article from 1838, he tells of an aspiring writer of Gothic tales who visits the editor of Blackwood's magazine, who asks for advice. Your writer of intensities must have a very black ink, a very big pen with a very blunt nib. Some examples were The Dead Alive, you would swear the writer has raised in a coffin. The Confession of an Opium Eater, plenty of fire and fury, decidedly unintelligible. He also mentions The Telltale Heart, like three-quarters burlesque, especially when you think about the literary output of Juniper the Baboon. Most of Poe's stories have floozy-boo business at the end. Poe knew this, and he knew how to play the trick well. A final comment. One of the deepest insights I find in the writing of Edgar Allan Poe is how he reveals to us human nature and the evil that lurks inside every human being cannot come out without being confronted by some kind of light. So in practically all of his stories, we find that the perpetrator of a crime ends up confessing. You would say the Cask of Amontillado is the exception because he never confesses. But the writing of the story in itself is a confession. So that confirms the rule. We cannot keep our skeletons inside the closet. They have to come out, first. And second, I think this is also very revelatory of human nature. His narrators are obsessed with convincing us that they are not mad. What does that reveal to us? When we push too hard, that's because there's a problem there. For example, if I go around saying, I am responsible, I am a responsible person, I am a mature adult, what am I trying to confirm? I need confirmation because I know deep inside that I'm not. When the narrator goes around saying, I'm not insane, I'm not a madman, I can convince you that I proceeded in a very logical way. Nobody would proceed in such a logical way if he were mad. All of those claims only confirm that the narrator is just pushing, is just trying too hard to convince himself or to convince us of something that he just knows too well. So I hope you enjoy reading Edgar Allan Poe, and I hope this review or this survey over his life was explanatory to some degree, and it will help you to appreciate better the writings of Edgar Allan Poe. Thank you.